Welcome, everyone. My name is Rawi Abdallah. I'm the faculty director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, and we are delighted that you're joining us today for this event. I have a very brief but important role, which is I wanted to say a few words of deep, heartfelt gratitude to Maxime Schreier, who is, as you know, an accomplished author, a novelist, an academic, a professor at Boston College, and also for the past several years, the director of the project on Russian and Eurasian Jewry at the Davis Center at Harvard. And these events have been so wonderful and so intellectually stimulating and emotionally engaging. And so I wanted to just introduce Maxime briefly and share our deepest thanks for the energy and insight and wisdom he's brought to these events. Maxime, let me hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Ravi. Good afternoon. I'm still Maxime Schreier. I'm very happy to be here. And thank you for the kind words, which I really appreciate. I also, Ravi, would like to thank you and all the colleagues who've worked on this project, but especially Penny Skalnick, Danielle Wallner, and Marielle Tamora, without whom this really would not have happened. And also to thank our sponsors, Genesis Philanthropy Group, which has been very generously sponsoring the project on Russian and Eurasian Jewry, and also the Harvard Center for Jewish Studies, and of course the Davis Center, where the project lives and breathes. Thank you. I'm very happy to welcome Professor Michael Martell, a wonderful scholar and a good friend. I would like to introduce him, and I want to say that he's a towering figure in modern Slavic studies, especially in the field of Russian poetry and poetics, and also Russian-German literary and cultural relations. Michael Martell studied comparative literature at Yale, at Harvard, where he received his PhD, and also studied at the University of Constance in Germany and at Moscow State University, and has since 1990 been teaching in Princeton's Slavic department, where he is a full professor. And I'm just going to scratch the surface and name some of Michael's books: Russian Symbolism and Literary Tradition, Goethe, Novalis, and the Poetics of Vyacheslav Ivanov, The Development of Russian Verse, Meter, and Its Meanings, one of my personal favorites, The Cambridge Introduction to Russian Poetry, and a commentary to Pushkin's lyric poetry, 1826 to 1836. Michael Martell has also edited and has been very generous as an editor and a promoter of other scholars' work, a number of books, and also very important archival materials in German and Russian. And I just want to mention one recent project, which Professor Martell worked on with Philipp Gleisner, Vyacheslav Ivanov und seiner deutschsprachigen Verleger, einer Chronik in Briefen, which came out in 2019. And today's talk stems from a very large and I think tremendously important project that Michael Martell has been working on, which is an annotated edition of the correspondence of the two protagonists of his talk, Evsei Shor and Rudolf Roeßler. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Michael. His talk is titled In Battle for the German Mind, Evsei Shor, Rudolf Roeßler, and the Vita Nova Publishing House. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. I will now attempt to pull up my PowerPoint. Good. Okay. Visible? Good. So thank you, Maxime. I really appreciate the opportunity to introduce this material. Let me start by saying I thank you. You mentioned that I have been doing a lot of archival work, and that indeed is the case. And when one does archival work, one of the things you realize is that sometimes what you think you're working on is not as interesting as the thing you happen on. And this is precisely the case here. You mentioned that most recent book that I did with a former graduate student of German materials. And sort of when I was doing that, I came across this other material, which it seemed to me was really far more interesting, quite frankly. And so it's also far more voluminous, but this is what I've been working on now for some time. This is basically, usually when I give a talk, it's sort of an interpretive talk and reading a text a certain way as against another way. This is a little bit different. Here, I'm just introducing material that I think there's not too much to sort of debate or about. It's really just a matter of material that's unknown and that I think really deserves to be known. So these two figures corresponded for a number of years, but especially intensely from 1934 to 1936, just hundreds and hundreds of letters. And it concerns the foundation of this anti-Nazi publishing house in Lucerne in Switzerland. There's a lot of, the letters touch on so many subjects, any literature, obviously, philosophy, religion, but also politics. And they're so wide in their range that it's almost amazing. It gives coverage of this period in a way that I've really never seen anywhere else. After the war, there's a break. 1940 is the last letter until after the war. They find each other again. At this point, one of them is still in Lucerne, the other is in Palestine, and I'll discuss how all this happens. But what the Roeßler writes to Shor in Palestine and says, are you still alive? Basically, it's been 5 years since they've been in any contact. And Shor writes back and says, yes, we were so worried about you. And I was inspired by your letter to go back and read all of our correspondence, because Shor typed his correspondence. And so he had both sides of the correspondence. That's why I have access to it. And he says, I reread our letters, and it occurred to me that this is just an unbelievable panorama of European life in those years, and we should publish it. We should publish it in our own lifetime. Well, that project, like many others, never went anywhere, but I feel like I'm picking up on that suggestion. And indeed, that's my, the present project that I'll be talking about today. So let me begin. This is our the first of our two heroes, Evsei Shor. He's a Russian Jew. This picture is taken in 1910 when he is beginning university studies in mathematics in Moscow. Shor comes from a very cultured and educated family. His father is a major pianist, very significant pianist, very well known, and knows basically the entire cultural elite in Russia. His house is a meeting place of all sorts of artists and thinkers. Even though there's a lot of anti-Semitism, obviously, in Russia in this period, he doesn't seem to, suffer from this in any way. He knows all sorts of people, not only, leading Jewish figures, but really all of the leading cultural figures. So his son, Evsei, grows up in this environment and decides he's a very good student. He decides he wants to study mathematics. Then he switches over at a certain point to humanities. But because of various events like the First World War and other things, he never actually finishes his studies. He has no degree. But after the revolution, he begins to serve, like all the intellectuals really who don't immediately leave, in various Soviet cultural organizations. And this is not unusual. It doesn't mean you're a card-carrying Bolshevik or anything like that. It's simply that if you wanted to survive, excuse me, you had to serve in one of these organizations. But he does this, with good intentions. I mean, he's really interested in culture generally. So here's a picture, actually, not a very good one, but the best we have, of him in one of these organizations. This is the Narkompros, the People's Commissariat of Enlightenment, which one might call, I don't know, something like the Ministry of Education. In any case, he's part of the arts committee. And the person, if you can see right in the middle there, is Wassily Kandinsky, the famous artist. Two to the left is Shor. They both end up teaching in a sort of institute for the arts, or the study of the arts in Moscow. And Shor becomes a sort of secretary to Kandinsky. And in 1923, there's this decision that, or the decision made, I guess, in 1922, that they should form some sort of bureau in Berlin to collect German scholarship, European scholarship on various artistic subjects. And Kandinsky and Shor both go to Berlin to set this bureau up. Neither of them returns, and neither of them clearly had any intention of returning. This was not an uncommon thing in in the Soviet Union of these years, because there was a lot of pressure, obviously, on culture. Right about this time, I'm sorry, right about this time, many intellectuals are being forced to emigrate from the Soviet Union. At the time, it was considered extremely brutal punishment of intellectuals, but subsequently, obviously, it was they were treating them with kid gloves, given what the Soviets later did to intellectuals. But anyway, it's a time where it's pretty clear the writing is on the wall. Things aren't going to be great in the Soviet Union. Shor finds his way to Germany, and he decides that he's going to remain. Not so easy. He has no legal reason for being there, but with a little help from his friends, and he's very well connected in the Russian community, he becomes a student at the University of Freiburg. This doesn't look like much, but it took me years to get, so I'm proud to show it. This is a page from the book of students attending Freiburg University, and you can say his name, Shor, by the way, spelled S-C-H-O-R, which is, of course, the German spelling. First name, Evsei, not so easy to read this handwriting, that's J-E-W-S-E-I. He's from Moscow, Rusland, from Russia, they say, where he's born, presumably. And what the words underneath there say is actually the really important thing, which is that he has the das akademische Bürgerrecht, which means he has the residency permit, thanks to the fact that he's a student. This, by the way, is, you see 1929, or it's for 1929. And this was the thing that he becomes a student at about 1923 or 24, and he remains a student. He doesn't really want to finish, in the sense that, as we have in the present day in the United States, students who are foreigners who don't want to finish because then they're going to be deported. They have no legal right to be here. As long as they're students, the right to be there. So he basically fits in that category. So he is, he's one of these, what they used to call ewiger Student, eternal student, someone who really doesn't have a lot of interest in finishing. But it's not like he's lazy. He's actually taking the courses extremely seriously. He's studying philosophy. And by the way, when he starts out, he can barely speak German. His German is quite poor, but he works doggedly. And this is one of his characteristics. He's an extremely hard worker. And within a couple of years, he's not only, freely contributing to these philosophy seminars, and this was, by the way, center of philosophy at the time. This was where Husserl was teaching, Heidegger was teaching there. This was a major department of philosophy, and he knows he's working with all these people. But he's also translating Russian philosophers into German, which he starts doing again within a couple of years of being in Germany. It's quite remarkable. So his German is not perfect, but it's amazingly good. He's kind of thing where he makes sort of small mistakes where he doesn't know the gender of a word, or he never quite gets the German plurals right, even though German plurals are not so hard. But he has a huge vocabulary. He writes long Germanic sentences, freely. He can get his points across extremely clearly, extremely well. But of course, everything he writes needs to be looked over by a native speaker. In 1928, he marries. It's actually marries for the second time. The first time was a short-lived marriage, ended before his emigration. And he marries Nadia Friedlander, who is another Russian Jew. And they actually remained together until his death in 1972. In 1932, he decides that he's going to try to make a living as sort of an independent, he's still a student, by the way, but he's trying to make a living as sort of a translator, an essayist, a writer, and he decides they should go to Berlin because there are a lot more opportunities in Berlin. When he first gets there, he's very disappointed. The city itself, the climate is terrible. Nadia keeps getting sick. The distances are so enormous that you can't really meet anyone. So the one great thing is the Staatsbibliothek, the library, which has absolutely everything you could possibly want and which he visits all the time. Towards the end of that year, however, he meets Rudolf Roeßler. And this changes his life in significant ways. Who was Roeßler? Well, this is, again, not the most impressive document, but it took some doing to get it, so I show it to you. This is from the City Archive of Augsburg, which tells you who Roeßler was. It tells you, and this is the old handwriting, so if you know German but can't read this, it's not surprising because this old handwriting takes a lot of practice to read it. Anyway, his name is Karl Rudolf, but Karl is a name he never uses, but that's his real name, Karl Rudolf Roeßler. His profession, he is married, it tells you. His profession is Redakteur und Schriftsteller, which means editor and writer. His religion is Protestant, that's a P. He's born on the 22nd of the 11th month, November 1897. He is married on the 19th of December 1925, married in Munich, and his wife is named Olga Hofmann, that's her maiden name, and she was born in December of 1905, which means she's getting married essentially very shortly after her 20th birthday. If you see the name Olga Hofmann, you might be tempted to think that one, she's either Russian, or two, she's Jewish, or both. But in fact, neither is true. It shows clearly that her religion is that she's Catholic. And indeed, it gives her parents' names, and her mother's name is Crescens, which is an extremely Catholic name. So there's no question that she's Catholic. And as far as her knowledge of Russian, it's non-existent. I know this from lots of things, including the correspondence. You might wonder why she's named Olga, and the answer, I don't know, but doing a little bit of poking around, it seems that most likely she's named after a Russian princess who married into the German House of Württemberg in the 19th century, who was known for her good deeds and was extremely popular. So that's probably where the name Olga comes from. There don't seem to be any Russian roots whatsoever. This is Roeßler and Olga in the upper picture. We're told Berlin in the 1930s. I don't know how you know it's Berlin in the 1930s, but the editor of the volume this comes from definitely did his homework, so I'll take his word for it. And below is another picture of Roeßler. Now Roeßler himself was from Augsburg, or actually he was born in Bavaria, a different small town, but he lived in Augsburg mainly. And he comes to Berlin in 1928 because he gets a job with an national theater organization, which puts out the journal Das Nationaltheater. That's just to give you the letterhead there. But he's basically in charge of this enormous organization. And he not only is running that journal, all of their books, but he's also writing books himself. This is an advertisement for some of his books. You can see Rudolf Roeßler, Schauspiel 2829. That means is basically a discussion of all of the dramas that were premiered that year. And then you see below the same title with 1929 to 30. So he's doing sort of annually covering German theater. Meets Shor, and they have a lot of common interests. Not only theater, which they take as a sort of moral institution. And I should say that there's a lot of sort of avant-garde theater that's being done at the time. Brecht is writing, Roeßler has no interest in very little interest actually in that. He's really a sort of traditional type, he's interested in sort of more traditional theater, and he's interested in theater as a possible means of sort of religious renewal, which is exactly, by the way, Shor's interest as well. I mentioned that Roeßler is a Protestant, but he's an extremely broad, he has extremely broad interests in religion so he's by no means a sort of, the fact that he married a Catholic is already itself indicative that he's not sort of a closed-minded as far as religious experience goes. And meeting Shor, who's Jewish but fascinated by Christianity, they have a lot to speak about. The first sort of document that shows that they sort of know each other is this very minor thing, which I throw up there just because I have it. This is a sort of what do you call it? A order form for books, and they're sending from this Verlag, the publishing house that's connected with this organization, theater organization, and they're sending a couple of things free of charge to Shor, a catalog and one other thing. But what's interesting is that Shor and his wife change addresses at the start of 1933. They move to the Tempelhof area in Berlin, and by what I believe is no coincidence at all, they live about a 3-minute walk from Roeßler's house. So whereas he was always complaining that, they couldn't really make friends because the distances were too great in Berlin, here they solved that problem by moving right next to Roeßler. And I suspect, though I don't have the, anything to prove that Roeßler probably made him aware that that this apartment was available. For the next 10 months, the two of them are constantly in contact. Well, actually, the four of them, the wives as well. And they're discussing, we don't really know, but what we know is that this was an incredibly important period in the lives of both of them, because in their subsequent letters, they will always refer back to this time in Tempelhof as this idyll, where they were, just this incredibly happy time. Now, if you realize what was going on in Germany in the first 10 months of 1933, this was hardly a happy time. And it was hardly a happy time for either of them, because within the first few months of 1933, this organization that Roeßler works for is closed by the Nazis. The Nazi takeover has taken place. One of the first things they do is boot everybody out who's going to be free thinking. So Roeßler loses his job. The theater journal ceases to exist. The theater organization ceases to exist. By the way, the very final issue of that journal, though they didn't know at the time was the final issue, has the first publication of an essay by Shor. So they're, in the background of you name it, the Gleichschaltung is taking place, and the book burnings are taking place against this in Berlin, by the way. Against this background, you have Shor and Roeßler meeting constantly and making plans. And we don't know, obviously there's no documentary evidence of what precisely they were making plans about. That there is a very, sorry, that's not what I wanted to show. This is a letter from a different publishing house, different Swiss publishing house, to Shor, because what Shor is involved in, one of the ways he's trying to make money is by translating these Russian philosophers. And you could actually make not a great living, but you could make a living, scrape by at least by being a translator in these times. Germany has always paid translators pretty decently, and Switzerland. So this is a letter that Shor received in, I believe, May of 33, shortly before he leaves the country for good, from this publishing house in Switzerland that he's cooperating with, where he's publishing a translation of the many works of the émigré philosopher Nikolai Berdiaev. The letter is extremely boring, and most of it is, well, you should hand it in by this date, and the margins will be like this, and the very technical stuff that's uninteresting to anyone except the translator. But when you get to the very final paragraph, which I fear is not very visible here, what it says, and that final paragraph, by the way, so this is the flip side of the letter, the final paragraph sort of carries on into the margin there. It says, by the way, in your own interest, we should make you aware that all the letters we receive from you are being opened by the German border authorities. And we know this because they're putting a stamp on it. At that time, the Nazis actually put a stamp on saying, this has been examined by us. So they said, so these are all coming to us for some time now with the Nazi stamp on it. And we make you aware of this because no one else, no other letters that come from Germany does this happen with. So clearly, Shor somehow has become a person of interest. This conceivably has something to do with the discussions that he and Roeßler are having, but I don't know anything more than that. He leaves Germany shortly after this, not because of that, of course, he was planning to anyway, because he realized there's no future for him in Germany. Obviously, the Nazis are going to make things impossible for him as a Jewish intellectual, and he recognizes that. His father, this famous pianist, was always a Zionist, had left in the 1920s to go to Palestine, where he's, sort of one of the main cultural figures. So he's very well connected, and he can get his son and wife visas, which he does. So they go to Italy for what they think is 2 weeks, but they're not just Shor and his wife. They actually have the sister-in-law as well. It turns out she doesn't have a visa, and by the time it takes them so long to get a visa for her that their visas are no longer valid, they have to start from scratch and get more visas. And in a word, they spend a year in Italy before they go to Palestine. And this is when the correspondence with Roeßler really picks up. Shortly after Shor leaves for Italy, Roeßler leaves for Lucerne, where he sets up this publishing house. There you have the Vita Nova Verlag stationery. And the point of this publishing house is to publish anti-Nazi material. But the trick is to do it in a way that you can still sell it in Germany. In the 1930s, the book trade was quite complicated. So it was always the case, and it's still the case, that for a German publisher in Switzerland, you need a market outside of Switzerland. It's not big enough market. Germany is obviously the big market. When the Nazis took over, they tried to assure the Swiss that everything was going to continue as before. They could sell whatever books they wanted in Germany. It didn't quite work that way, but still an amazing amount could be sold. And basically, Roeßler was counting on this. So he would produce books that didn't, shout out their anti-Nazi qualities in the title. You kind of had to read pretty closely, but you could see, if you did read closely, that these books were indeed directed against National Socialism. So, for example, he published in Shor's translation a book by Berdiaev called The Truth and Lie About Communism. So nominally, and in fact, the book really is about Bolshevism, which Berdiaev knew quite a bit about. Berdiaev had been deported from the Soviet Union. But if you read closely, of course, there were passages that sounded exactly like he was talking about German fascism. And indeed, as Roeßler writes in his letters to Shor, the newspapers, and there were, by the way, newspapers that were not pro-Nazi at this time, the newspapers picked up on this and they quoted just whole sections from this book, supposedly reviewing it, but sections that so clearly seemed to comment on National Socialism that you really had to be blind not to see it. So this was sort of the strategy, and Roeßler, I should say, was an extremely good businessman. So he really was working things out carefully, and the press in the early years is quite successful. One of the books he publishes is this one. Shor's own book, Deutschland auf dem Wege nach Damaskus, Germany on the way to Damascus. This is a New Testament reference of the conversion of Paul, or Saul to Paul. In German, that's a sort of set expression, unmissable. But what did he mean by that? Well, the book it's a bit chaotic. It was produced very quickly, Shor, again, the conditions he was working under were really amazing, because he's, trying to put food on the table in Italy where he has no right to work, and he's working frantically, and they under very difficult pressures. Anyway, he manages to throw this book together, and it is, as I say, a bit chaotic. But the main point of the book is a reflection of the religious views that he and Roeßler share, which is namely that the big problem in Germany is that the Catholics and Protestants are so busy sort of complaining about each other that they're not thinking about how to solve the problems and really become Christian. It sounds like the book is, you would think that his name is there, Shor is a Jewish name, obviously. You would think it's if you didn't see the author's name, you could really think that the author was either Catholic or Protestant, but certainly Christian. And in fact, at the end of the book, there's a passage where he kind of makes it sound like he's Russian Orthodox. Of course, he wasn't Russian Orthodox, but there's a question. The ending of the book is actually really quite powerful, describing this discussion that he supposedly witnessed between he as a supposed representative of Russian Orthodoxy, that he observed between a Catholic and a Protestant. where they're sort of debating the fate of their country, of Germany, and where one of them says, my greatest fear is that where the churches fail, the forces of evil will take up, and that's obviously precisely what happened. So that's one of the first books that is published in that series. These Vita Nova publications. This one I spent maybe a little more time on because it's a really interesting, and in fact, I believe it's a unique book. Relatively early on, Roeßler writes to Shor and he says, I've just been reading the latest stuff that Goebbels is saying, and I can tell you that this anti-Semitism is just the tip of the iceberg. This is going to get worse and worse, and we really have to do a book about it. Shor responds and says, it is awful, obviously, and it's terrible for the Jews, but it's equally terrible for the Christians, because this persecution of Jews has nothing to do with Christianity. This is a return to sort of paganism or barbarism. There's nothing Christian about this, and the danger is that this is going to sort of lower Christianity to this level of pure brutality and violence. Roeßler is really moved by this and says, that's exactly right. That's the book we have to write. And the book that they eventually produce is called, I'll translate it sort of loosely, the danger to Christianity from Rassenwahn, from sort of racial craziness. Literally, it was a word that was used to sort of critique Nazi policies of race. So through this race mania and through the persecution of Jews. So the task for Roeßler then is to get people to contribute to this volume, and he writes to all over the place. He wants to get as broad a group of people to comment as possible. In fact, he even tries to get Italian fascists to contribute, as long as they're not anti-Semites, and the Italian fascists weren't anti-Semites. So he tries to get sort of major figures in the Italian fascist party. Doesn't succeed, but it's a long story. I could go into it if we needed to. This is all reflected in these letters, of course, and the letters are granular detail. But it's sort of sad. It is sad reading, because you see how many people he approached and how few of them were ready to write an essay on the subject. In one particularly sad instance, he contacts the Archbishop in Salzburg, Austria, which of course is free at this time. This is 34, this is all going on. And the Archbishop says, this is absolutely correct what you're doing, and here is my essay, writes the essay and submits it. Well, then shortly thereafter, this Archbishop, who's very high up in the Catholic hierarchy, is invited to the Vatican and sends a telegram from the Vatican saying, you can't print my essay. I take it back. So the essay doesn't appear, doesn't speak well for the Vatican. So he does manage in the end to get, with great difficulty, manages to get 6 contributors who are all listed on the cover. One is Berdiaev, of course, translated by Shor, but that's not indicated anywhere. Because the key to this volume is you don't want it to look like it was produced by Jews. You want it to, because the whole point is that this is a danger to Christianity. So he does manage to get people from, no one from Germany, but that I guess is understandable at this point given the situation, but he gets people from other German language areas that have not yet been taken over by the Nazis. So Prague, for example, Debrecen, right? So Hungary, and of course, Scotland and London. That's not too surprising. The other person worth mentioning is the one on the bottom, the other unaffiliated person, Sigrid Undset, is she was a Norwegian writer and a Nobel Prize winner. He had approached Selma Lagerlöf, who was also a Scandinavian Nobel Prize winner. She was not willing to write. She was, if you look, apparently not pro-Nazi, but there were other considerations, like then the Nazis are gonna attack you, and indeed that's what happened with Sigrid Undset. Both of these, they're not living in Germany, but they're. Roeßler writes in a letter to Shor, they've come down so hard on Undset that now the this Nazi newspaper has said they have to pull all books from libraries and destroy them, and not let any of her books be for sale in Germany. I don't know how soon that happened. I know that officially it happened in 1940, actually, but it seems like it was already happening after this book. That was a result of the publication. By the way, this is just the first page where you see Vita Nova Verlag, the name of the publishing house. Vita Nova, of course, a Dantean reference. Interestingly, after the book is published, Shor, who's now in Palestine, finally, is again, living a hand-to-mouth existence. Yes, he has a father there who's trying to help him, but he's trying to find a way to exist in Palestine. Obviously, the types of things he's interested in is not, you're not going to make a living off of that. So he's struggling, but nonetheless, he's still keeping this enormous correspondence with Roeßler. The mail takes about a week to go back and forth, which is kind of amazing when you realize the situation. In any case, there are letters from Palestine, Tel Aviv, which are quite astonishing. So this book comes out, and what does Shor say? He says it absolutely has to be translated into other languages. And so he gets to work on it. So this is a letter from May of 35. He says, Gefährdung, that's the title of the book, right? He says, well, there should be a Hebrew translation of it. And then he gives all of the details of how he's trying to arrange that. Then he says there should be, oh, sorry, that's not the one I was looking for. There should be a Swedish translation. He says, and he goes, he says, the main rabbi of Sweden was just here, and I spoke with him, and I told him about this, and he's going to try to get it translated. Below there, this Norwegian translation. He says, well, I have this connection, this musician who's in Norway, and he's a very major figure, conductor, and he'll try to get it translated. And then he says, and there should be a Russian translation. So this is very typical of Shor, this sort of energy to try to see this thing through, to get it into other languages. A bit later, here's this letter to a certain Felix Bloch, who you read for, if he says, I met this guy briefly, but we had a, kind of in Italy, we had an interesting conversation. I think he's very sympathetic. He just went to the United States. He's a scientist and he's at Stanford, and I'm going to write to him and try to get him to get someone interested in translating this into English. I was curious, who is Felix Bloch? Bloch, lots of Jews are named Bloch. I sort of looked it up. It turns out he won the Nobel Prize in Physics about 15 years after this. Unfortunately, none of these translations actually take place. So sure, but this is typical of the incredible energy that he's putting into these projects selflessly, because he feels so strongly that the people should know about this. This is one of the great successes of the Vita Nova publishing house, a book called Deutsche Menschen. The title, it means German people, really, and it sounds like a kind of Nazi-style title. The title comes from not the author. In fact, it was Roeßler who came up with this title. You'll notice that the cover of this book is written in sort of the German lettering. If you compare it to the standard Vita Nova production, very different, right? Well, presumably that's done to make the book look better on German bookshelves. It's not going to look like it comes from abroad. It's going to look like it was produced in Germany. Of course, if you go to the first page, it looks like all the other Vita Nova books because they didn't have the font to do that German Fraktur, which was standard in Germany. By the way, it wasn't created by the Nazis. It predates the Nazis quite a bit. But all books in Germany were published a different way. Books in Switzerland, once you open them up, totally obvious. But here, the cover indicates that it's or suggests that it's a German book. I should point out this is it says Deutsche Menschen, right? That's the title. A series of letters chosen and introduced by Detlef Holz. Detlef Holz was a pen name of Walter Benjamin, the famous writer and thinker. He did this book. He had actually begun doing this as a sort of newspaper column in the 30s, but he this was then cut off, and he couldn't do it anymore after the Nazis came to power. He was a persona non grata, and he was desperately trying to find a way to publish this book. He found his way to Roeßler, and Roeßler did indeed publish it. As I say, Roeßler was the one in charge of the title, which sounds very Nazi. The book is not at all Nazis. These letters come from, they're written by people like Goethe and sort of major figures in that sort of great humanistic tradition of German, mainly 19th century. But this was a book that was extremely successful, even went to a second printing, and Benjamin seems to have survived for a year on the proceeds from this book. So it was again a sign that Roeßler was managing to reach an audience, and that he was an exceedingly clever businessman. Things get, of course, a lot worse as the time passes. The correspondence with Shor, which is incredibly, granular up till 1936, becomes less and less frequent. In 1940, it cuts off altogether. And the last letter we have from Roeßler says, I'm just despondent. I don't think it's possible to run a publishing house at this point. And the reason is because every time he was basically surviving not only on selling in Germany, which was getting harder and harder. By the way, in 1939, Germany for the first time comes up with a list of books of so-called harmful and undesirable books. And generally it's by author and book, but there is one small section where they list publishing houses. And among those very few publishing houses where the entire production is forbidden is the Vita Nova Verlag, which meant that it did hit its target, but unfortunately too successfully. In any case, so he couldn't make any money in Germany. He was making money, by selling them to Austria until the Anschluss, right, to Sudetenland, until that's taken, all of these German, what used to be called Auslandsdeutschtum, so the Germany outside of Germany, but the Nazis are taking over one place after another. Among the first things they do when they come in is confiscate every Vita Nova book from the booksellers and destroy them. So obviously not compensating them. So the press is in terrible shape. Roeßler then, so the correspondence that I worked on sort of ends here, but Roeßler moves in a different direction, which is something I can't really tell you much about, though this is insofar as people know Roeßler, this is what they know. He becomes a spy. And he becomes the main conduit for the Nazi military secrets being sent to the Red Army. He's considered the most significant spy in the Second World War, but the circumstances of that spying are still largely, it seems to me, a matter of conjecture. If you try to read the literature on it, people make all sorts of statements and then give no sources. So I'm, as a scholar, somewhat skeptical of some of those explanations. But the fact, it is absolutely a fact that he does this. It's also a fact that he's arrested briefly by the Swiss in 1944 because the Nazis are pressuring the Swiss to stop this activity, the radioactivity between the Soviet Union and Switzerland. He doesn't stay in jail very long because the Swiss, again, there's sort of different ways of looking at this. It might have been to try to protect him from the Nazis. It's a complicated story, but anyway, after the war, he writes to, he picks up the correspondence again. A couple months later, he writes to Shor, and concerned that he might not have survived, Shor, and the correspondence picks up again. But what happens is it's quite sad in the case of Roeßler, because Roeßler says, all of these other presses, these Swiss presses that basically caved into the Nazis, that gave them exactly what they wanted, they're all on their feet again. They're all being helped. But Vita Nova, the only one that really, emphatically was anti-Nazi, nobody's willing to help, partially because he's not Swiss, right? He's German, even though the Germans took away his citizenship at a certain point, but still he's technically German. Insofar as the Germans know anything about what he did, he's considered a traitor for giving away their secrets and losing the war for them. So he gets, and he looks over at what's happening in Germany itself and sees all of these former Nazis coming to prominence again, thanks to the Americans, who are really, yes, they chose, 15 of the worst and tried them, but really, there were horrible people who were put into positions of authority. The Entnazifizierung, right? The getting rid of the Nazis was really a joke by and large, and Roeßler knows this better than anyone else. He becomes extremely disillusioned. And at a certain point in like 52, he's actually arrested, supposedly for sending, for spying for Czechoslovakia. It seems like there really wasn't much of a case to be made there, but the Cold War is already picking up, and he sort of becomes a victim. He actually he spends almost a year in jail. He comes out, he's completely a broken man, completely disillusioned. And this comes through in the few letters that exist from this period to Shor. It's extremely sad reading. Shor himself has had a kind of crazy career. This guy is unbelievable how he can reinvent himself, because when he gets to Palestine, there's sort of nothing for him to do in terms of the stuff he really loves, this philosophy and religion and all of these questions. So he falls back on what he knows from childhood, which is that he's a pretty good pianist. And he becomes a music educator. Because he's incredibly, thorough in everything he does, he actually creates an entire conservatory from scratch. And he becomes a major teacher, a teacher not only of great Palestinian, Israeli, later pianists, but of pianists who are really world class to this day. Some of his famous, most famous student is, I think, Joseph Kallichstein, who maybe is watching this talk. Anyway, it's a incredible career shift. And if you read the letters with Roeßler, you have no idea that this guy was also an incredible musician. You'd think he was just some sort of philosopher or theologue, whatever, someone who in theologies. It's just utterly astonishing, the range of interests and the talent he has. So I don't have a good sense of how much time I've used. Maxime, can you tell me how much time I have?
That I need to, what about maybe 10 minutes, Michael? Sure.
Oh, 10 minutes. Okay, that's actually more than I expected.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. Anyway, I'll just show this. There is this novel. This is a German novel, obviously, Geheime Agenten, where Roeßler is one of the major characters. It's a novel, but based on historical evidence. It's quite a long novel, but if you know German, I actually highly recommend it. It tells you a lot about Switzerland in the Second World War. And this guy on the bottom right is Roeßler. He's one of the characters, as I say, fictionalized, but the author of this novel actually did quite a bit of homework and read in the archives in Lucerne, which I have not had access to, and so fills in, certain things that one wouldn't know otherwise. At certain places, he sort of, there's just no record, and the author kind of makes it up. But anyway, it is interesting that people are now again paying attention to Roeßler. I think, let me maybe just a couple of last points about the correspondence, which I haven't spoken about so much. It's really an extraordinary thing to read, just because it covers so much ground. They're not simply discussing, what they should or should not publish, which covers, basically everything that's being written in this period, but they're also being discussing the latest political developments as they're happening. And some of the letters, one reads them, they're just sort of astonishing and how interesting they are. I think with both of these, Roeßler he did publish in the 20s, and Shor wrote essays at various times. But to me, the most interesting thing they actually wrote, that their legacy is in these letters. There are such people, who they're sort of better as letter writers than as writers. And I believe both of them fall into this category. So I just take, choose a couple of interesting excerpts. In 1935, there's a Congress of Zionists in Lucerne, of all things. So of course, Roeßler, who's extremely interested in all sorts of religious questions, attends, and he writes to Shor, and he says, it's actually somewhat frightening the way these people understand Judaism, because it's sort of completely biological. He says, especially this younger generation, he says, it's kind of the flip side, or in some horrific way, it reflects the sort of Nazi attitudes towards race and the Blutenboden politics. He says it seems to be coming through here. He's horrified by this, because for both Shor and Roeßler, religion it's not a matter of biology at all. It's something that develops organically, that has to adapt and change, but keeping the basic truth, and both of them have this surprisingly ecumenical, especially for the time, sense of religion, which really doesn't fit in neatly with anything that's being written, which is, I guess the tragedy of the time. Both of them are interested in sort of the idea of Europe as a whole, and one of the ideas of the books is that they're supposed to be conceiving, not showing the things that separate all of the countries in Europe, but the things that should ideally bring them together. I give an excerpt from a letter from Shor to Roeßler, just again to give just a kind of sense of what he's saying, what they're writing about. So this is from 31st August 1936, and he's writing to Roeßler and says, you should consider republishing Heinrich Heine, his essay on the called on history and religion. On the history of religion and philosophy in Germany. It's a famous essay, and it ends. The essay is written for a French audience, and it ends with a sort of very impassioned passage that I'll just paraphrase, which is basically saying, you Frenchmen, look out, because the Germans, they're very sort of slow and clumsy, but when they finally do something, they do it in a horrific way. And when, these Germans, go to war, you better run for cover, because it's going to be really bad. And he says, there's going to be thunder, and that's going to make the eagles fall dead from the skies, and the lions in the most distant deserts of Africa are going to sort of curl up their tail and run into their dens. So he quotes this long passage, which he of course types out completely. He types all his letters, and he says, I don't think Heine, we should understand him metaphorically at all. I think what he's talking about is really happening. Again, this is 1936, and he says, indeed, when the German attack on Slavic countries begins, the eagles are really going to fall out of the skies, and one's going to hear the echoes of this in the most distant reaches of Africa. So it's sort of frighteningly prescient, and extremely, again, you kind of don't feel like you're reading a letter. You feel like you're reading an essay or something like that. And this is the case a lot of the time. So, I think maybe I'll just close on that and open it up to comments or questions.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much, Professor Martell. This is a fascinating story. And of course, what you've given us is, to use your own term, just the tip of the iceberg, because I think when this book comes out, I expect it to be unputdownable as a story. And so thank you so much for that. And we have a few questions that, if you don't mind, I'd like to pose. The first question is, I think, naturally about Shor and the Russian Berlin, because he's at Freiburg. I think he visits Berlin, but he is not part of that great Russian emigre culture at its peak. And I think when he gets there, it's already very much in decline. For instance, I always like to look for things that I know best. So I was very curious if Shor has any connection to Nabokov. And there's a peculiar, Michael, I'm sure you know this, there's a letter that Nabokov sends to Vera, his wife, who is at the time in Saint-Blaise. And this is the summer of 1926. She's undergoing treatment at a sanatorium in the Black Forest. And he wrote to her almost daily. And he says, Mr. and Mrs. Shor have been trying hard to make a connection with us and really putting a lot of pressure on me. And in fact, it's not even clear if it's our Shor or not, but I think that's about it. So my point is, I wonder if you could sort of talk a little bit about sort of Shor's lack of very manifest connections to the great Russian emigre Berlin.
Yeah. You're right that he gets there towards the tail end of that Shor you're talking about. Who knows who that Shor is? It's a common Jewish last name. it certainly isn't him, because he's not there with his wife at that point. He's not married. But as far as his connections to the Russian emigration, he did have significant connections, and that's what kind of saved him. The most important was Stepun, Fyodor Stepun, who was a Russian German, Baltic German, who had actually gotten he did get a degree from a German university. So when he was thrown out of Russia, deported in 22, he could actually do much better than most Russians. And he remains in Germany. He actually remains in Germany even through the war. And survives, and after the war becomes a sort of celebrity even. But even before then, he's a very major figure in Russian emigration.
And a professor at a German university.
Right, and he becomes a professor at a German university, even takes the oath to Hitler, though he clearly didn't believe in it. And it saved him another year or something like that. Finally, they got rid of him and forced him to retire, as they did with all the undesirables. But yes, so Stepun is really one of the few success stories of Russians in Germany. As you know, they go there the first couple of years, and it's cheap to live in Berlin because the economy basically doesn't exist. A lot of the Russians are getting very minimal support from the YMCA in the US, which is, I believe they were getting $10 a month, which was plenty. You could survive on $10 a month. So, but anyway, Stepun is doing pretty well. He's a family friend of the Shors from way back. In Moscow. In fact, has the memoir where he says, after the revolution, their apartment was the last oasis of civilization in Moscow. So he's very close to that family, and he helps Shor. He's the one who gets him to go to Freiburg. He has connections, and they sort of use those connections that really stand him in good stead. Whenever Shor is translating, he often consults Stepun. So this is the most significant connection to the Russian emigration. With Berdiaev, they don't actually know each other that well. Berdiaev finds his way to Shor. There's actually a book. Actually, not only is there a book, it's right here. It's a fairly large book. It's an excellent book, and it's the correspondence between Berdiaev and Shor. It's about a couple of 100 pages. But what you learn from that is that they weren't that close. It's just that Berdiaev, as a philosopher trying to make a living, was desperate for translators, and he found his way to Shor. And it should be said, actually, this is quite interesting, that Shor, his first translations into German, not done by Shor, had been very unsuccessful. And somebody said to Shor, well, why are these so unsuccessful? And he said, it's because Berdiaev writes in this completely clumsy, ridiculous way, and it really has to be edited and fixed up. So all of his translations, they're actually rewritings of Berdiaev's, and Berdiaev was willing to accept it because they actually sold much better when Shor made the changes. But it's funny to read the correspondence between Roeßler and Shor, because now Berdiaev is considered the major philosopher of Russian emigration, someone to be taken very seriously. But Shor and Roeßler are writing to each other and saying, this part is utterly ridiculous. It absolutely has to go. It's just wrong. And they omit it and say, well, that doesn't work for a German audience or something like that. So he really changes the texts considerably, but they're considered the best German translations of Berdiaev. So he doesn't know him that well. The other person he knows very well is Vyacheslav Ivanov, who's living in Italy. But Ivanov, and actually, when he goes to Italy on his way to Palestine, Ivanov actually, in a very unusual way, goes out of his way to try to find some way to let Shor, some stipend or something to allow Shor to remain in Europe, because as far as Berdiaev and Ivanov are concerned, going to Palestine is a terrible idea for him. And their logic actually is not totally wrong. What they're saying is that the things you're interested in cannot be done in Palestine. And it turns out to be true. That's why he sort of shifts gears and becomes a music educator. That said, he does in Palestine meet and get to know a lot of the major figures. He gets to know Buber, for example. Buber is mentioned a lot of times in the correspondence. So.
Yeah, no, in fact, the tail end of your response kind of points to the direction that I wanted to interrogate a bit more, which is precisely that he arrives in Mandate Palestine, it seems, not necessarily because he has Zionist beliefs, and really as a refugee from history, and also because, of course, his father, David Shor, is already established there, correct? And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about about Shor's years prior to the establishment of the State of Israel, particularly the late 1930s and the wartime years, and how things fared for him.
Yeah, well, the letters aren't as detailed from this period, but at the beginning they really are. 35, 36, they're actually quite detailed. And he's trying to find some way to survive. And actually, it's again a bit of a sad story. Had he left when he was intending to, after 2 weeks in Italy, there was actually a position for him at a school of I can't remember exactly where. It might have even been Hebrew University. But then it took him a year to get there. They gave the position to someone else, and he was out of luck by the time he arrived. But he recognizes there's no way he's going to make inroads into that community. They're just not going to make a space for him.
And there were very few jobs, truly.
Right. But professionally, he has no chances. But personally, he gets to know everybody, all of the major figures in there weren't that many of them, right? So the meeting with Buber, for example, he sends his book to Buber, and he's assigned that 20-minute slot to speak with the great man, and he writes to Roeßler, he said, well, I went in there, I was supposed to speak to him for 20 minutes, and 2 hours later I left, and we agreed we should be writing to each other rather than meeting. And Buber actually says about his book, he says it's extremely interesting, but you don't make clear enough where you stand on these issues, which I think is a fair criticism, though, Shor would say, well, that was the whole point. I was trying to write a book that made people not to tell them what to think, but to make them think themselves. In any case, so he does meet people, and he's trying. His father was an incredible. The whole family, obviously, incredibly idealists. They're incredible idealists. So his father was trying to bring music, to the hinterlands, to this poor Jewish settlers, and he's a hero in Israel, his father, in a way that that Evsei unfortunately isn't. He's much less known.
So no, that's exactly right. Which is how I knew of the Shor family. I think it's primarily through his father's ministrations and his father's work. Yeah.
So he even accompanies his father on some of these trips to these kibbutzim, and he writes these long letters describing these kibbutzim. I doubt there are any letters like this in the world, because he's so detailed about who he meets, the discussions he had, and he's constantly trying to raise these kind of significant theological questions with all of these people. I think they sort of look at him like he's from another planet, which in a certain sense he is. But some of these kibbutzim there, he finds people who speak Russian and German so that he can communicate with them. He does, of course, learn Hebrew. Apparently he spoke Hebrew, like I suspect he spoke German, extremely fluently with a very strong accent.
But that was very common for that generation.
Yeah.
Great. And so the next question actually is connected to Olga Shor, whom you mentioned, who was Evsei Shor's cousin. This comes from our colleague, Edward Weisband in Israel, who has done very good work on Chodasevich, among other things, sort of to talk more about the relationship and the correspondence between Evsei and Olga.
Yeah, as you may know, Edward would know. Hi, Edward. Good to know you're out there. Almost the entire Ivanov archive is online at this point, but the part of it connected to Olga Shor is not online. So I'm planning to be in Rome next year, and one of the things I want to look at is that part of the correspondence. But to the small extent that I've looked at this, what I see is that there was this bit of a condescending attitude towards Shor, coming from Vyacheslav Ivanov. Vyacheslav Ivanov really admired.
You'd be surprised.
He really admired David Shor, but Vyacheslav Ivanov was, the superstar of free revolutionary Russian culture, and Evsei Shor is an incredible, dobry mali, right? An incredibly nice guy who seems to be interested in lots of questions, but I think there's a little bit of snobism. It's probably partially an age thing, but partially also just, Vyacheslav Ivanov. One of the problems with translating Ivanov is that Ivanov, as against Berdiaev, had fabulous German, and Shor sends his translations to Ivanov, and Ivanov rewrites them completely in German. Yeah. And sometimes rewrites them in a way he says, it's not that this is closer to the original, it's just I changed my mind about what it should say. So now I've, written something else. And because Ivanov takes so long, in fact, a book of Ivanov's essays on theater is announced and supposed to come out from Roeßler's publishing house in Berlin. And the reason it doesn't come out is not simply because of the Nazis, because they, for a while, would have honored that contract. It's because Vyacheslav Ivanov can't be bothered to produce a final version of this book. So, yeah, so Olga Alexandrovna seems to have, she loves him as a cousin, but I think has a slightly condescending attitude toward him. That's my impression.
That's great. That's great. This is really, really fascinating. I guess we're almost out of time. I just want to ask a very, very I guess, unacademic question, which is sort of going back to the spy story. Does Evsei have any role in the spy story? Or if this were if this were a film script, would he have a role as a spy?
I'll tell you, that's a great question. Obviously, the main years of spying, there's no contact whatsoever. And in his letter, the first letter coming after the war, you would think that Roeßler says, by the way, I contributed in a small way to the, in my own small way to the victory over the Nazis. He doesn't say anything like that. So, but there is one letter that's very strange. That's from 1934, I believe, or maybe 30, I'm pretty sure it's 34, where Roeßler's just setting up his, actually, I can't remember, it's 34 or 35. He's just setting up the Vita Nova Verlag, and he's going to make a trip back to Germany, which is pretty bizarre because he didn't leave in good graces. The Nazis apparently, accused him of embezzling money, which is completely untrue, obviously. But he's going to go back to Germany. And and he announces this to Shor, and Shor writes to him and he says, you're a very courageous person, and I'm worried precisely because of your courage. And you should keep in mind, be very careful about what you say. Remember that the walls have ears, which is a strange comment to make to someone who's just a publisher of books, after all. And when he comes back, he writes that he spends about a couple of weeks in Germany. He writes a letter to Shor and he says, well, I spoke with following people about the publishing and got these authors, so that part's set. But then he says, and I did in my questions in trying to understand what the atmosphere was like, I spoke with members of the Reichswehr. Now I never said he was a soldier in World War I, Roeßler, and he did have connections with the army, and apparently fairly high connections. That's one of the theories of where I think that probably isn't true, but it's one of the theories about how he got all of this highly classified information that he sent on to the Soviets. But anyway, he says, so I spoke with people in the Reichswehr, and this is early enough that there were, actually throughout the Nazi period, there were people in the military who were not in favor of the Nazis. And he says, and what I discovered was extremely sad because there's a sort of sense of, not complacency, a sense of desperation that there's nothing to be done. In other words, that there's not going to be an uprising from within. He doesn't say quite in those words, but that's obviously what he's hinting at. So there's a sense that there must have been some sort of knowledge of some discussions that they were having in a more sort of practical political way, but that's absolutely the extent of it. I know nothing else beside that.
That's great. I'm afraid we are out of time, but the story continues. Professor Martell, thank you so much for being with us. Good luck finishing up this book. I really, really enjoyed your lecture. And I also want to thank our audience for being here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.